It starts like any other Tuesday evening. The city hums, streetlights flicker on, people head home. Maya Jones, a quiet librarian known more for recommending books than raising her voice, locks up the downtown branch. But tonight, the ordinary shatters. Turning a corner, she witnesses something brutal, something ugly, an abuse of power under the cloak of authority, perpetrated by a decorated police officer. She sees it all. Days later, that same officer, Detective Frank Dixon, man known for his swagger, his quick temper and a simmering prejudice barely hidden beneath the badge, corners her. He thinks she's just another scared black woman he can easily silence. He leans in close, voice laced with menace, threatening her job, her safety, trying to bury the truth she holds. What Detective Dixon doesn't know, what he couldn't possibly fathom in his arrogant blindness, is that he just threatened the sister of the most powerful lawyer in the entire state. He just tried to intimidate the sibling of the Attorney General. A storm of justice is brewing, fueled by a brother's protective fury and a sister's quiet courage. Exposure, accountability, and a stunning reversal of power are coming. Stick around. You are not ready for how this unravels. And hey, before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. What city, what state, what country? Drop it in the comments below. We love seeing our global community gather for these stories. The heavy oak doors of the city's main library branch clicked shut behind Maya Jones, the sound echoing with satisfying finality in the cavernous, emptying marble foyer. It was 8:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, well past closing time. Streetlights outside were already casting long geometric patterns through the tall arched windows, painting the familiar bronze bust of the library's founder in shifting shades of orange and shadow. Maya sighed, a quiet sound lost in the vast space, rolling her shoulders to ease the ache from hours spent hunched over inventory spreadsheets in the stuffy archives. The annual count was always a marathon, a necessary evil that left her eyes blurry and her mind numb, but there was a certain quiet satisfaction in the order restored, the neat columns aligning, the knowledge that every volume was accounted for. She ran through her mental closing checklist one last time. Systems powered, down security gates locked, staff room tidied, her own desk cleared except for the stack of books she was taking home. Satisfied, she slung her worn canvas tote bag, perpetually smelling faintly of old paper and binding glue, over her shoulder. Inside nestled a half-eaten tuna sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a dog-eared collection of contemporary poetry, and a dense historical novel she was determined to finish before the next book club meeting. Just the essentials for a quiet evening alone. Stepping out onto the wide granite steps, the cool night air felt good against her flushed cheeks. The city hummed around her, a familiar urban symphony of distant sirens, rumbling bus engines, muffled music drifting from passing cars, and the murmur of late-night pedestrians. It wasn't the hushed sanctuary of her library stacks, but it was home. She zipped up her light jacket against the slight evening chill, the metal teeth rasping in the relative quiet of the library plaza. Her usual bus stop was 3 blocks away, a walk she'd made thousands of times, usually lost in thought or listening to a podcast. Tonight, though, fatigue made the walk feel longer. The prospect of her small, cozy apartment, with its overflowing bookshelves and slightly lopsided armchair, particularly appealing. She turned onto Elm Street, a narrower side street lined with a mix of small businesses, a vintage clothing store, a tailor shop, a struggling independent bookstore, most now dark and shuttered. The crowd thinned here, the streetlights spaced further apart, casting deeper pools of shadow between their cones of illumination. Maya quickened her pace slightly, a habit ingrained from years of navigating the city alone after dark. It wasn't usually fear, more a practical awareness, a desire to simply reach her destination without incident. Her mind drifted towards her brother, Marcus. She really should call him later, just to check in. He worried, especially since taking the Attorney General post, the weight of the state on his shoulders, yet he still found time to fret over his librarian little sister walking home late. She smiled faintly. His protective streak was both endearing and occasionally exasperating. As she approached the corner of Elm and Garrett Lane, notorious for its overflowing dumpsters and the perpetually flickering neon sign of Honest Abe's, "Pawn," a sound broke through the low thrum of the city. shouting, angry, muffled voices, sharp and percussive. It wasn't uncommon in this part of downtown, often just late-night revelers or arguments spilling out of the nearby bars. Maya instinctively slowed, her senses heightening. She usually just kept walking, head down, minding her own business. But then came another sound, sickeningly distinct, a heavy, wet thud, like a sack of potatoes hitting concrete, immediately followed by a choked gasp, a desperate fight for air that was abruptly cut off. Every instinct screamed at her to turn, to walk away quickly, to pretend she hadn't heard. This wasn't her business. Getting involved was dangerous. But something else, a deeper sense of horrified curiosity, rooted her to the spot. The sounds came from the narrow, garbage-strewn alleyway beside the pawn shop, a dark moor between brick buildings. Against her better judgment, compelled by a visceral reaction to the sound of pain, she found herself inching closer, using the looming bulk of a graffitied dumpster as cover. The stench of stale refuse and something vaguely chemical stung her nostrils. She peeked around the edge, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might be audible. What she saw wasn't a drunken brawl. Under the weak, buzzing glow of a single bare bulb, high on the brick wall, two uniformed police officers had a young black man pinned face down against the grimy, damp bricks. He looked barely out of his teens, thin frame trembling, face obscured against the wall. One officer, younger, maybe mid-20s, with a nervous energy about him, kept glancing around, his hand hovering uncertainly near the man's shoulder. The other officer dominated the scene. He was older, thick-set, with a square jaw clenched tight and eyes that held a chillingly cold, almost bored expression beneath the brim of his cap. This was Detective Frank Dixon. Though Maya wouldn't know his name until later, his posture radiated absolute control, absolute power. Dixon had his knee pressed brutally into the center of the young man's back, grinding him against the rough brickwork. Even from her vantage point, Maya could see the raw abrasion blooming on the man's exposed cheek. The victim wasn't fighting back. He seemed barely conscious, his body limp, except for the shallow, ragged breaths he struggled to draw. Dixon muttered something low and harsh, then, with a calculated, almost casual movement, drew back his fist and delivered a sharp, vicious blow to the man's kidney area. A muffled groan escaped the victim. Dixon hit him again, and again. Each impact was punctuated by the slight, involuntary jerk of the young man's body. Maya felt nausea rise, hot and acidic, in her throat. This wasn't subduing a suspect. This was a beating. It was calculated cruelty. Just as she thought it couldn't get worse, she saw Dixon do something that turned her blood to ice. While the younger officer looked away for a split second, perhaps deliberately, perhaps out of discomfort, Dixon subtly, deftly reached into his own uniform pocket. His movements were smooth, practiced. He palmed a small, clear plastic baggie containing a nondescript white powder. With a quick, furtive glance down the empty alley, his gaze sweeping right past Maya's shadowed hiding spot, without registering her presence, he dropped the baggie onto the filthy pavement near the young man's outstretched, unmoving hand, planting evidence. It happened so fast, so seamlessly, it was almost surreal, but she saw it, undeniably. The cold, methodical corruption of it stole her breath. Panic seized her. She had seen too much. If they saw her, her mind flooded with terrifying possibilities. She pressed herself flat against the cold, rough metal of the dumpster, praying for invisibility. Slowly, carefully, hardly daring to breathe, she began to inch backwards away from the horrifying tableau. Every scrape of her shoe sole on the gritty pavement sounded like a gunshot in her ears. She couldn't look back. The image was burned. Onto her retinas, the victim's helplessness, Dixon's cold brutality, the glint of the plastic baggie on the ground. She finally reached the mouth of the alley, melting back into the relative anonymity of Elm Street. Her legs felt like lead, her body trembling uncontrollably. She broke into a stumbling run, not looking back, heading towards the distant, beckoning lights of the main avenue and her bus stop, the weight of the secret she now carried pressing down on her like a physical burden, the alleyway truth a terrifying ghost clinging to her heels. Detective Frank Dixon gunned the unmarked sedan away from Garrett Lane, the adrenaline from the physical confrontation already fading, replaced by a familiar, simmering irritation. Beside him, Rookie Officer Miller fidgeted, his knuckles white, where he gripped the dashboard. Miller looked pale under the sickly orange glow of the streetlights, his eyes still wide with a mixture of fear and something Dixon despised, moral uncertainty. "Relax, kid," Dixon grunted, not taking his eyes off the road. "He resisted, end of story." "But Detective," Miller started, his voice thin, "did we really need to? He wasn't fighting back much at the end. And the baggie?" Dixon shot. Him a look sharp enough to cut glass. "What about the baggie? Found it right near his hand after he was subdued following a violent struggle, consistent with intent to distribute. That's what the report will say, because that's the reality we create, to keep this city from tearing itself apart over every punk resisting arrest. Got it?" He spat the words out, each one a tiny pellet of contempt. Miller swallowed hard, nodding, mutely, shrinking back against the passenger door. Dixon sighed inwardly. Rookies. They came in full of academy ideals, thinking policing was about textbook procedures and Miranda rights. They didn't understand the street, the filth, the necessity of sometimes bending the rules at no enforcing the real rules to maintain order. That kid in the alley? Just another lowlife polluting the neighborhood, probably high, definitely looking for trouble. Dixon felt a grim satisfaction. He'd cleaned up a small piece of the street tonight, delivered a necessary lesson. The planted drugs were just insurance, a way to guarantee the paperwork stuck, to ensure this particular piece of trash stayed off the streets for a while. It was efficient, necessary. Protecting the thin blue line sometimes meant adding a few strategic details to the narrative. They pulled into a dimly lit parking lot behind a 24-hour diner a few blocks away to write up the initial report, the air thick with the smell of grease and stale coffee. Dixon dictated the key points, Miller typing them dutifully into the patrol car's laptop, his earlier reservations seemingly suppressed by Dixon's sheer force of personality and the implicit threat of crossing a senior detective. Subject observed. Acting suspiciously. Initiated contact. Subject immediately became combative. Resisted arrest violently. Necessary force utilized to subdue. Small quantity of suspected narcotics recovered at the scene. Dixon crafted the narrative carefully, hitting all the required keywords, building a justification for the force used, burying the reality of the calculated beating and the planted evidence beneath layers of procedural jargon. Miller typed without comment, his face carefully blank. Dixon figured the kid would learn or he'd wash out. Either way was fine with him. Days passed. The arrest report was filed. The suspect processed, the incident seemingly closed. Just another Tuesday night statistic. Dixon moved on to other cases, the alleyway encounter fading into the background noise of his demanding, often brutal job. Until Sergeant Davies dropped a supplemental report printout on his desk. "Canvas follow-up from that resisting arrest on Garrett Lane the other night, Dixon," Davies said gruffly. "Neighbor thinks they saw someone ducking out of the alley around the time you radioed it in. And there's a vague hit on some low-res city cam footage near the Elm Street entrance, figure just barely visible." Dixon felt a familiar prickle of annoyance. Loose ends, he hated loose ends. He picked up the report, scanning it with a practiced eye. Most of it was useless, neighbors hearing shouting, nothing definitive. But then one entry caught his attention. A Miss Eleanor Higgins, resident of an apartment overlooking Elm Street, reported seeing a woman matching a general description, medium height, dark coat, carrying a bag, hurrying away from the direction of the alley mouth around the estimated time of the incident. Higgins hadn't gotten a clear look, but she thought the woman looked startled. And the preliminary review of the grainy city cam footage, though mostly obscured by a delivery truck, showed a fleeting figure matching that description exiting the alley's general vicinity. Not enough for a positive ID, but enough to potentially corroborate Higgins's observation. Enough to be a problem. Anything come of it? Dixon asked, keeping his voice casual. Nah, Davies shrugged. Nobody else saw anything specific. Probably nothing. Just tying up the paperwork. But Dixon's mind was already working. A potential witness. Near the alley. Startled. He didn't like it. Even a vague sighting could cause complications if someone higher up decided to pull threads. He made a mental note to check the library's closing time that night, cross-referencing it with the incident timeline. A hunch, cold and calculating, began to form. Later that afternoon, using his precinct credentials to run a quick, off-the-books database search cross-referencing library employee records with residential addresses near the downtown branch, he found her. Maya Jones. Address? Apartment 4B, 212 Elm Street, directly past the mouth of the Garrett Lane Alley on the typical route towards the main bus terminal. Employment? City librarian, main branch. Closing shift supervisor on the night in question. Age? 32. Marital status? Single. Race black. No prior criminal record. Perfect, or rather perfectly problematic, and yet perfectly manageable in Dixon's worldview. He stared at the information on his screen, a slow, predatory smile touching his lips. A librarian, a single, black woman living alone in a modest downtown apartment. This wasn't some connected lawyer or a politician's wife who could cause real trouble. This was exactly the kind of person his experience told him was susceptible to pressure. She probably had seen something, and people like her, in his experience, tended to have an overdeveloped sense of civic duty mixed with a healthy dose of fear when confronted by authority. They might talk to internal affairs, file a complaint, make noise he didn't need right now, especially with that rookie Miller still looking jumpy. He considered the official channels. He could request a formal interview, send a couple of uniformed officers or junior detectives to her apartment, but that created a paper trail. It involved others. It risked her getting spooked and lawyering up immediately. No, this required a more personal touch. His touch. He prided himself on his ability to read people, to apply the right kind of pressure to get the desired result. He'd done it countless times before. A quiet word, a veiled threat, leveraging perceived vulnerabilities. It almost always worked. People were predictable, especially people he categorized as powerless. He visualized the encounter. Show up at her apartment, maybe late evening when she felt most isolated. No uniform, keep it unofficial, but let the badge be visible. Start friendly, then pivot. Remind her how messy things can get. Suggest her memory might be faulty. Hint at consequences, job security, maybe trouble with her landlord, the general unpleasantness of being involved in a police matter against her own interests. Nothing explicit enough to be easily proven as witness tampering, just enough carefully applied fear to make her reconsider whatever she thought she saw. Make her understand that silence was the path of least resistance, the safest path for someone like her. He felt a surge of confidence. It was a clean plan, efficient. He'd neutralized this potential problem quickly, quietly. He pictured Maya Jones, probably timid, easily flustered, overwhelmed by a detective showing up at her door. He imagined her stammering denials, her eyes wide with fear, quickly agreeing that she hadn't seen anything after all. He would walk away, the loose end neatly snipped, the official report protected, his actions buried. He never once considered the possibility that Maya Jones might have resources he couldn't fathom, connections that reached far beyond her library card. His prejudice and arrogance formed an impenetrable shield, blinding him completely to the reality that he wasn't planning to intimidate a powerless librarian. He was about to walk directly into the orbit of the State Attorney General. The dramatic irony was absolute, though utterly lost on the man meticulously planning his descent into career oblivion. 2 evenings later, the rhythmic click of Maya Jones's knitting needles was the only sound punctuating the comfortable silence of her small apartment. Rain lashed against the 4th-floor window, blurring the city lights into abstract smears of color. Inside, however, was her sanctuary. Bookshelves lined nearly every available wall, overflowing with novels, poetry collections, historical texts, a testament to her profession and her passion. A worn but beloved armchair draped with a half-finished Afghan in shades of teal and grey, sat angled towards a small reading lamp, casting a warm, inviting glow. The air smelled faintly of chamomile tea and old paper. Maya had just settled in after a long day at the library, takeout container of Pad CU cooling on the coffee table beside her, ready to lose herself in the intricate patterns of yarn and the quiet solitude she cherished. The alleyway incident, though still a heavy weight in the back of her mind, felt momentarily distant, buffered by the familiar comfort of her routine and the protective walls of her home. Then came the knock. It wasn't the tentative tap of a neighbor or the cheerful rap of a delivery person. This was a hard, percussive sound, 3 distinct, forceful raps that didn't just knock on the door, but seemed to resonate through it, vibrating the very air in the room. It was sharp, impatient, authoritative. Maya froze mid-stitch, her knitting, needles clicking together softly as her hands stilled. Her heart gave a sudden, violent lurch, instantly flooding her system with adrenaline. Who would be knocking like that at almost 9 o'clock on a rainy Tuesday night? She wasn't expecting anyone. Her brother, Marcus, always called first. Her few close friends knew better than to drop by unannounced this late. A prickle of unease, sharp and specific, traced its way down her spine. It wasn't just the unexpectedness, it was the nature of the knock. It felt less like a request for entry and more like a demand. She carefully placed her knitting aside, the soft wool suddenly feeling alien in her suddenly clammy hands. Moving, silently on slippered feet, she padded across the worn rug towards the door, her earlier sense of peace evaporating like mist. The rain drummed against the window pane, amplifying the sudden, tense silence within the apartment. She reached the door, her breath held tight in her chest. Her apartment door, old but sturdy, featured a small, slightly distorted peephole. Hesitantly, almost dreading what she might see, she pressed her eye against the cool metal rim. The hallway outside was dimly lit by a single, flickering fluorescent tube, casting long, eerie shadows. Filling the distorted fisheye lens, instantly recognizable despite the lack of uniform, was the man from the alley, Detective Frank Dixon. His face, magnified and slightly warped by the peephole, looked sterner, colder than she remembered. Impatience radiated from him. His jaw was set, his eyes, narrowed and devoid of any warmth, seemed to bore directly through the wood and metal, searching for her. He wasn't wearing his police cap now. His short, bristly hair was slicked back slightly, damp from the rain. He wore a nondescript dark jacket over a collared shirt, clothes that screamed off-duty cop, trying too hard to look inconspicuous. He shifted his weight, glancing impatiently down the empty hallway before turning his gaze back towards her door, raising his hand as if to knock again, even harder this time. Maya recoiled from the peephole, her heart hammering against her ribs. Like a trapped bird, him, here at her door. Why? How did he even know where she lived? The questions swirled in a vortex of fear. This wasn't official business. If it were, he'd likely be in uniform, perhaps with a partner, during daylight hours. This felt different, personal, predatory. Every nerve ending screamed at her not to open the door, to pretend she wasn't home, to call someone. But who? Calling 911 felt absurd. He was the police. Calling Marcus felt like escalating things prematurely, pulling him into something potentially dangerous based only on a knock at the door. But what if she didn't open it? What would happen then? Would he just leave? Or would he become suspicious, mark her down as uncooperative, find another way to confront her? Ignoring a detective, even one acting unofficially, felt risky, potentially giving him grounds to claim. She was obstructing something. Maybe it was better to face him, find out what he wanted, maintain a semblance of control, however illusory. She was just a librarian. He was a detective. Surely there were limits to what he could do. Taking a deep, ragged breath that did little to calm her racing pulse, Maya made a decision born more of perceived necessity than courage. Her hand, trembling almost uncontrollably now, reached for the deadbolt. She slid it back with a soft thunk that sounded deafeningly loud in the tense silence. Then her fingers hesitated on the doorknob before turning it slowly. She opened the door only a crack, intending to speak to him through the narrow opening, maintaining a physical barrier. That intention proved naive. Dixon, anticipating her caution, reacted instantly. As the door opened even slightly, he subtly shifted his considerable weight forward, using his shoulder to nudge the door wider, preventing her from closing it again. It wasn't overtly aggressive, but it was undeniably forceful. A clear physical assertion of control. Before Maya could react or protest, he stepped across the threshold into her apartment. He filled the small entryway, his presence immediately overwhelming the cozy space. He brought the damp chill of the rainy night in with him, along with the faint, acrid smell of stale cigarette smoke clinging to his jacket and a whiff of cheap, sharp cologne. He stood there for a moment, his eyes doing a quick, dismissive sweep of her living room, taking in the towering bookshelves crammed 2 rows deep, the slightly lopsided lampshade, the worn armchair, the half-eaten container of noodles on the coffee table. His gaze lingered for a fraction of a second on the sheer volume of books, a flicker of something unreadable. Contempt? Amusement? In his eyes before they settled back on her. He seemed to consciously block the doorway, preventing any easy retreat for her, subtly establishing his dominance over the territory. Maya instinctively backed up a step, clutching the collar of her cardigan tighter, feeling intensely vulnerable and exposed in her own home. The lock she had just unbolted felt miles away now. "Maya Jones?" he asked, the name rolling off his tongue, with a practiced ease that belied the menacing undertone. It wasn't a question seeking confirmation, it was a statement, letting her know he knew exactly who she was. Yes?" Maya stammered, hating the tremor in her voice. Can I help?" "You, detective." Dixon offered a tight, humorless smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah," he said, his voice low and gravelly, deliberately intimate yet threatening. "I think you can. Got a few questions for you about the other night." He paused, letting the implication hang heavy in the air between them. Down by the pawn shop in the alley. The casual mention of the location, the scene of the crime she had witnessed, sent another jolt of fear through her. He knew she was there. And he was here. So now inside her sanctuary to talk about it, the interrogation had begun. Detective Dixon didn't wait for Maya to fully process his presence or the implications of his statement about the alley. He took another deliberate step further into her small living room, effectively closing the distance between them and forcing her to retreat again, bumping softly against the arm of her beloved reading chair. The intrusion felt profound, violating the invisible boundaries of her personal space, making her own home feel suddenly alien and unsafe. He moved with a practiced ease, an awareness of how physical presence could be used as a tool of intimidation without laying a hand on someone. His eyes continued their sweep of her apartment, but this time the assessment felt different, less dismissive, more calculating. He seemed to be cataloguing her life, her apparent solitude, reinforcing his initial assessment of her vulnerability. "Look, Maya," he began again, his voice dropping into a lower register, adopting a tone that might, under other circumstances, sound confidential, almost paternal, but here felt deeply manipulative and menacing. He used her first name again, the unearned familiarity a deliberate tactic to disarm and unsettle. "Let's not play games. I know you were down there the other night, near the alley off Garrett Lane. Saw you myself clear as day, ducking behind." That dumpster. This was a lie. He'd only glimpsed movement, hadn't seen her face, but stating it as fact was part of the strategy, designed to make her feel exposed, caught, already implicated. He watched her closely for a reaction, a flicker of panic in her eyes, a nervous tick. Maya remained outwardly still, though her heart hammered against her ribs. He hadn't seen her clearly, she was sure of it. But his assertion, delivered with such confidence, planted a seed of doubt, made her question her own memory, her own invisibility that night. I was walking home," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, hating how small and uncertain she sounded in her own living room. "I heard shouting." "Shouting," Dixon repeated, nodding slowly, as if validating her partial truth while dismissing its significance. "Right. Lots of shouting. Happens downtown late at night. Doesn't mean anything." He took another small step, angling himself slightly so he was between her and the door, a subtle physical maneuver that nonetheless screamed control. "Thing is, Maya," he continued, his voice becoming smoother, silkier, like a predator calming. "It's prey before the strike. Sometimes people are under stress. They hear things, maybe see things out of the corner of their eye. Shadows play tricks, you know? Especially in a dark alley late at night. Easy to get confused, misinterpret a situation. He paused, letting the implication hang, that her perception was unreliable, flawed, perhaps even imagined. Wouldn't want you making a mistake, he added softly, the threat now wrapped in feigned concern. Wouldn't want you going to internal. Affairs filing some complaint based on faulty memory. That gets messy, real messy, creates paperwork, headaches for everyone involved. He gestured vaguely with one hand, encompassing the unseen bureaucratic machinery he represented. Especially, his eyes locked onto hers again, the false concern evaporating, replaced by a cold glint. For someone who might have misunderstood what they saw. Maya swallowed hard, the fear coiling tighter in her gut. He wasn't just suggesting she was mistaken, he was actively trying to rewrite her reality, to gaslight her into doubting the brutal evidence of her own eyes. She remembered. The sickening thud, the choked gasps, the calculated planting of the baggie with chilling clarity. It wasn't a trick of the light or a misunderstanding, it was a crime. "I know what I saw, Detective," she said, surprising herself with the firmness that edged into her voice. It was still quiet, but the uncertainty was lessening, replaced by a burgeoning indignation. It wasn't a misunderstanding. Dixon's reaction was immediate. The thin veneer of manipulative concern vanished instantly. His eyes hardened into chips of flint. His jaw tightened, a muscle pulsing rhythmically near his temple. The shift was palpable, the air crackling with barely suppressed hostility. "No?" he challenged, his voice dropping again, becoming low and gravelly, stripped of all pretense. "Let me tell you what you didn't see. You didn't see a decorated officer defending himself against a violent felon resisting arrest. You didn't see the struggle that happened before you started lurking," he spat the word again, "in the shadows. You didn't see the reality of policing on these streets." He leaned in slightly, his presence suddenly feeling more physically threatening. "For you saw what you wanted to see, didn't you? People like you," he sneered. The barely veiled racism now surfacing, ugly and undisguised, always looking for an excuse to paint us as the bad guys, always siding with the criminals, trying to make martyrs out of street trash. You think you're some kind of hero? The accusation, the raw prejudice behind it, stung more than the fear. He wasn't just trying to silence her, he was trying to invalidate her character, her perception, her very identity based on a hateful stereotype. He saw her not as a witness, but as an antagonist, simply because she was black and had potentially seen him commit a crime. "Listen to me very carefully, Maya," he continued, his voice a low growl now, each word deliberate, weighted with menace. "You file some bogus report based on your misunderstanding, and things will get very unpleasant. For you. Understand? Librarians need their jobs, right? Quiet lives wouldn't want anything to disrupt that." He let the threat to her livelihood hang there. "And apartments have leases. Landlords can be particular, especially when tenants become involved in controversial matters." He paused, letting the implications sink in. He could interfere with her housing, her stability. "And it's a dangerous city out there," he added, his eyes sweeping over her slight frame with chilling assessment. "Accidents happen. People trip on uneven sidewalks. Sometimes folks just disappear, especially people who cause trouble for the wrong folks." The threat was no longer subtle. It was explicit, covering her job, her home, her physical safety. He was using the power of his badge, the implied threat of state-sanctioned violence and its shadowy, unofficial extensions, to try and coerce her into silence. He was betting on her fear, betting on her perceived powerlessness, betting that the instinct for self-preservation would override any sense of civic duty or moral outrage. He was betting that, like so many others he had likely intimidated before, she would simply fold. The air in the small apartment grew thick and suffocating, charged with the static electricity of Detective Dixon's barely contained menace. His explicit threats, targeting her livelihood, her home, her very physical safety, hung between them, poisonous and chillingly real. He had shed any pretense of procedural correctness or professional detachment. This was raw intimidation, leveraging the full weight of his perceived authority and the implied violence simmering just beneath the surface. He leaned in further, deliberately crowding her, forcing her back against the yielding softness of her reading chair until she could feel the worn fabric press against her shoulder blades. His physical proximity was overwhelming, a conscious tactic to dominate and unsettle, making escape feel impossible. She could smell the stale cigarette smoke clinging to his jacket more strongly now, mixed with the damp wool scent from the rain. Outside, and his cheap, cloying cologne, an olfactory assault that mirrored the psychological one. His face was mere inches from hers now. His eyes, narrowed into hard, unforgiving slits, bore into her, searching for the breaking point, the flicker of terror that would signal her submission. She could see the network of fine lines around his eyes, the slight discoloration of a fading bruise high on his cheekbone, likely sustained in some other violent encounter, the way his lips curled almost imperceptibly, in a sneer of contemptuous power. He clearly believed he had her cornered, trapped, terrified into compliance. "Are we clear, Maya?" he hissed, his voice a low, venomous rasp that scraped against her nerves. The question was rhetorical, a final turn of the screw. He wasn't seeking understanding, he was demanding capitulation. "You didn't see anything," he repeated, emphasizing each word, trying to hammer the lie into her consciousness through sheer force of will. "You weren't even there. You were home." He gestured vaguely towards her bookshelves, the irony apparently lost on him. "Reading one of your precious little books. Got it?" Fear, cold and paralyzing, was a physical entity inside Maya. It clenched her stomach, tightened her throat, made her limbs feel heavy and unresponsive. Every instinct screamed at her to agree, to nod, to say whatever he wanted to hear, just to make him leave, to restore the violated sanctity of her home. The potential consequences he'd laid out were terrifyingly plausible. Losing her job at the library, a place she loved, that felt like an extension of herself, would be devastating. Being evicted from her apartment, her small haven in the chaotic city, was unthinkable. And the veiled threat of physical harm. It resonated with generations of fear instilled in black communities regarding interactions with hostile law enforcement. He held the power to disrupt, perhaps destroy, the quiet, carefully constructed life she cherished. Agreeing seemed like the only rational path, the path of survival. But as he stood there, radiating smug certainty, expecting her inevitable collapse, something else began to stir within the icy grip of fear. It started as a flicker, a tiny spark of defiance deep within her core. It was fueled by the sheer injustice of it all, the brutal assault she had witnessed, the cold-blooded planting of evidence, and now this corrupt officer standing in her home, threatening her into complicity. It was fueled by the memory of the young man's terrified face pressed against the brick, his helpless groans. It was fueled by the insult of Dixon's blatant racism, his assumption that she, because of her race and perceived status, was an easy mark, someone whose voice didn't matter, whose truth could be easily erased, and then he crossed a final line. As if to punctuate his demands, to physically imprint his dominance, he reached out his hand. His thick, calloused fingers, smelling faintly of nicotine, brushed deliberately against the sleeve of her cardigan near her forearm. It wasn't a violent touch, but it was deeply invasive, condescending, a gesture meant to convey ownership and control, to remind her of her physical vulnerability in his presence. That unwanted touch, however slight, acted like a catalyst. It snapped the paralysis of fear. The spark of defiance within Maya ignited into a blaze of cold, focused anger. It burned away the hesitation, the impulse to placate. She wouldn't do it. She wouldn't let this man, this embodiment of corruption and prejudice, intimidate her into betraying what she knew to be true. She wouldn't become another silent victim, another statistic in the long history of silenced witnesses. Maybe agreeing was the rational path, but sometimes survival wasn't just about avoiding immediate danger. It was about preserving one's own integrity, one's own soul. The shift inside her manifested subtly on the outside. She didn't lash out, didn't scream or cry. Instead, a profound stillness settled over her. She subtly shifted her weight, creating perhaps only an inch of physical space between them, but it felt like reclaiming miles. She pulled her arm back slightly, breaking the unwanted contact. Her breathing, which had been shallow and ragged, deepened, becoming slow and deliberate. And, crucially, she lifted her chin almost imperceptibly, meeting his menacing gaze not with terror, but with a newfound quiet resolve that seemed to momentarily surprise him. The fear hadn't vanished. It still hummed beneath the surface like a high-tension wire, but it was no longer in control. Dignity, fierce and unexpected, had asserted itself. Dixon registered the subtle change, a flicker of confusion, perhaps even annoyance that she wasn't crumbling according to his script, crossed his face. He opened his mouth, likely to reiterate his threats to escalate the pressure, but before he could speak, Maya found her voice. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it held a steady, unwavering quality that cut through the tense atmosphere. "I think," she said, the words clear and distinct despite the tremor that still threatened beneath them, "that you are mistaken, detective." She paused, holding his gaze. "And I think," she added, the decision crystallizing in that moment, fueled by righteous anger and the sudden clear knowledge of the one power she did possess, "that I need to make a phone call." The librarian, the quiet observer, was about to turn the tables. Detective Dixon stared at Maya, momentarily taken aback by her quiet defiance. "Mistaken," he echoed, a harsh, incredulous bark of laughter escaping his lips. The sound was sharp, brittle, lacking any genuine amusement. It was the sound of offended authority, of disbelief that this quiet librarian would dare contradict him, dare challenge the narrative he had so forcefully imposed. "You think I'm mistaken?" He shook his head slowly, a condescending pity in his eyes now overlaying the menace. "Lady, you're scared, you're confused. You don't know what you're talking about." He took her statement about making a phone call as a pathetic bluff, a desperate, nonsensical attempt to grasp at some non-existent leverage. His experience told him that people cornered like this sometimes said irrational things. He decided to play along, to let her expose her own powerlessness, to further humiliate her before extracting the final necessary assurance of her silence. "Oh, yeah?" he sneered, folding his arms across his chest, leaning back slightly against her doorframe, in a posture of arrogant expectation. "The phone call, that's your big move?" His voice dripped with sarcasm. "Who you gonna call, huh? Ghostbusters? Maybe the library police?" He chuckled darkly at his own weak joke. "Or maybe you're gonna call your mommy, gonna tell her the big bad. Policeman scared you." He was enjoying this now, savoring what he perceived as her futile, flailing attempt to resist the inevitable. He pictured her dialing 911, only to have the dispatcher likely recognize his name and defer, or perhaps calling some insignificant friend who could offer nothing but useless sympathy. "Go ahead," he urged mockingly, gesturing towards the phone. On the end table with a flick of his wrist. "Make your call, let's see who rushes to save the damsel in distress. I've got time." He glanced ostentatiously at his watch, emphasizing his control over the situation, his belief that he held all the cards. Maya ignored his taunts, the juvenile insults bouncing harmlessly off the shield of her newfound resolve. The fear was still, there a cold knot low in her belly, but it was overshadowed now by a fierce, protective anger, not just for herself, but for the young man in the alley, for the truth itself. Dixon's smug confidence, his utter certainty of her insignificance, fueled her determination. He had no idea who he was dealing with, not because she was inherently powerful, but because of a connection he couldn't possibly fathom, a connection rooted in family, love, and, ironically, the very system he represented and corrupted. Her hand, surprisingly steady now, reached for the smooth, cool surface of her smartphone, lying on the small, cluttered end table next to her reading lamp. Her fingers moved across the screen with practiced familiarity, unlocking it with her thumbprint. Dixon watched her every move, a contemptuous smirk playing on his lips. He noted the slight tremor in her fingers as she navigated the touchscreen, interpreting it solely as fear, missing the undercurrent of steely purpose. He shifted his weight against the doorframe, settling in to witness her inevitable failure. Maya bypassed the keypad, tapping directly into her favorites list. Her thumb hovered for a fraction of a second over the contact name, listed simply as Marcus, with a small heart emoji beside it, a detail Dixon couldn't see from his vantage point. She pressed the call icon. The phone began to ring, the sound, unnaturally loud in the tense quiet of the apartment, punctuated only by the drumming rain outside. One ring, two rings. Dixon's smirk widened slightly. Maybe Marcus wasn't picking up. Maybe this whole charade would fizzle out before it even began. Then, on the third ring, the call connected. The ringing stopped, replaced by the faint electronic click of an answered line. Maya lifted the phone to her ear, turning slightly away. From Dixon, affording herself a small measure of privacy, though she knew he was listening intently, his expression radiating mocking curiosity. "Hey," she said into the phone, her voice regaining its normal calm cadence, a stark contrast to the fear-laced whispers he'd heard moments before. The normalcy of her tone seemed to momentarily confuse Dixon, throwing him off balance again. "Sorry to bother you," Maya continued, her gaze flicking briefly towards the detective before returning to an indeterminate point on her bookshelf-lined wall. "I know you're busy." She paused, listening to the voice on the other end. A voice Dixon couldn't hear but whose presence was now undeniably real. "Yeah," she said softly. "I'm okay physically, but—" Her voice hardened slightly. "There's a Detective Frank Dixon here, badge number 714. She deliberately recited the badge number clearly, ensuring it was captured by the phone's microphone. "In my apartment, uninvited. He seems to think I didn't witness him brutally assaulting a suspect and then planting narcotics evidence down near Garrett Lane the other night. He's making threats." She delivered the information concisely, factually, without overt emotion, letting the weight of the words speak for themselves. Another pause as she listened intently to the response from the other end. Dixon watched her face, trying to decipher the conversation from her expressions, his smirk slowly fading, replaced by a flicker of genuine curiosity mixed with lingering contempt. Who was she talking to? Some legal aid hotline? A reporter? "Okay," Maya said after a moment, nodding slightly. Yes, I understand." A longer pause. "He's right here." She looked directly at Dixon now, her expression unreadable. No fear, no triumph, just a calm neutrality that was perhaps more unsettling than any overt display of emotion. "Hold on," she said clearly into the phone. "He wants to talk to you." With that, she lowered the phone from her ear and extended it towards Detective Dixon, holding it out flat on her palm. The screen glowed dimly, displaying only the standard call interface, offering no clue as to the identity of the person on the other end. The gesture was simple, direct, almost mundane. Yet in the context of the preceding threats and intimidation, it felt like a moment of profound, unexpected power shift. She wasn't arguing, wasn't pleading, wasn't threatening him back. She was simply offering him the phone, inviting him into a conversation he hadn't anticipated, with someone whose identity remained, for a few more agonizing seconds, a complete mystery. The ball was now, quite literally, in his court. Detective Frank Dixon stared at the outstretched phone in Maya Jones's hand. The device itself was unremarkable. A standard smartphone, maybe a couple of years old, nothing flashy. Yet held out to him in this small, book-filled apartment, after the preceding confrontation, it felt alien, almost menacing. Her calm demeanor, the utter lack of fear in her eyes now as she offered him the phone, was deeply unsettling. His instincts, usually sharp when it came to reading fear and bluffing, were suddenly scrambled. What was this? Some kind of elaborate prank? A desperate last-ditch effort to call his bluff? His initial reaction was pure derision. He almost laughed again, tempted to swat the phone away, to tell her to stop wasting his time with pathetic games. Who could she possibly have called that he, a decorated city detective, would need or want to speak to? He ran through the possibilities, again in his head. A supervisor at the library, useless. A low-level public defender trying to act tough. He ate them for breakfast. Maybe some bleeding heart community activist known for filing frivolous complaints. He'd dealt with plenty. Of those, they were all noise, no real power. There was simply no one in her perceived world who could possibly hold any sway over him. Yet, her calmness, the steady way she held his gaze, the deliberate clarity with which she'd stated his name and badge number into the phone, followed. by the accusation of assault and evidence tampering. It wasn't the panicked babbling he'd expected. It was concise, factual, almost like dictating an official report. And the final line, "Hold on, he wants to talk to you," delivered with such quiet certainty. It wasn't a plea. It was an instruction. Against his better judgment, fueled more by a condescending curiosity and a desire to definitively expose her bluff than any real concern, Dixon reached out and took the phone from her hand. His fingers brushed hers briefly, and he noted with a flicker of annoyance that her hand was surprisingly steady, not trembling like before. The phone felt cool and smooth in his own grip. He raised it towards his ear, still holding Maya's gaze, his expression radiating smug skepticism. He was ready to unleash a torrent of dismissive sarcasm on whoever was foolish enough to be on the other end. "Yeah, Dixon here," he barked into the receiver, his voice intentionally rough, projecting annoyance and authority. "Who the hell is this supposed to be?" He fully expected a stammering response, maybe the voice of some concerned but ultimately powerless friend or family member trying to intervene. There was a fractional pause on the other end, a beat of silence that felt charged with unexpected. "Wait." Then a voice spoke. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, but it carried an immediate, unmistakable aura of power and command that cut through the cheap speaker and resonated deep in Dixon's bones. It was a voice accustomed to being listened to, accustomed to wielding authority at the highest levels, calm, cold, precise, and utterly devoid of deference. "Detective Dixon," the voice stated, the syllables perfectly articulated, each one landing like a precisely placed ice pick. "This is State Attorney General Marcus Jones." Silence. Absolute, deafening, soul-crushing silence descended upon the small apartment. The only sounds were the relentless drumming of the rain against the window pane and the sudden, frantic pounding of Dixon's own heart against his ribs. So loud he thought Maya must surely hear it. State Attorney General Marcus Jones. The name, the title, it didn't just register. It detonated inside Dixon's skull. Marcus Jones, the top law enforcement official in the entire state, the man whose office prosecuted cops who crossed the line, the man currently spearheading a statewide task force on police accountability, the man whose picture was frequently in the papers, whose reputation for being tough, brilliant, and politically savvy was legendary. That Marcus Jones. His mind, which moments before had been filled with arrogant certainty, now felt like a blank slate wiped clean by sheer paralyzing shock. He physically recoiled, stumbling back a step as if the voice itself had delivered a physical blow. His face underwent a grotesque, rapid-fire transformation. The smugness, the contempt, the racist certainty, all vanished instantly, replaced by a wave of disbelief so profound it bordered on the comical. Disbelief morphed into dawning comprehension, which immediately curdled into raw, unadulterated panic. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, chalky grey. His eyes wide and staring, fixed on Maya with a look of utter, horrified realization. His sister! The connection slammed into his consciousness with the force of a derailed freight train. Maya Jones, Marcus Jones, the quiet librarian, the unassuming nobody he had threatened, harassed, and racially profiled. The woman he assumed had no power, no connections worth mentioning, was the sister of the most powerful legal authority in the state. The sheer cosmic irony of it, the catastrophic scale of his misjudgment, was too immense to fully grasp. Yet its implications were terrifyingly clear. He hadn't just stepped on a crack. He had nonchalantly tap-danced directly onto a landmine. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. No sound emerged. The hand holding the phone began to tremble uncontrollably, the device suddenly feeling impossibly heavy, burning against his palm. He felt a wave of dizziness, the room seeming to tilt slightly around him, the carefully constructed world of his own perceived impunity, his belief in the impenetrable blue wall, his confidence in his ability to manipulate and control situations. It all shattered into a million irreparable pieces in that single devastating moment of revelation. The phone, seemingly possessing a malevolent life of its own, slipped from his suddenly numb, nerveless fingers. It tumbled through the air in what felt like slow motion, before landing with a soft, muffled thud on the worn fibers of Maya's patterned rug. It lay there, screen still glowing faintly, a small, innocuous object that had just detonated his entire career, possibly his entire life. He stared down at it, then back up at Maya, his expression a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The predator had become the prey, caught dead to rights, not by Maya herself, but by the invisible, immense power she had calmly summoned with a single phone call. The silence that followed the phone hitting the rug was thick, almost viscous. It pressed in on Dixon from all sides, amplifying the frantic drumming of his own pulse in his ears and the relentless patter of rain against the window. Sounds that seemed impossibly loud now in the absence of human voices. He stared down at the fallen smartphone lying innocuously on Maya's worn rug, its screen glowing faintly like a malevolent eye. It seemed inconceivable that such a small, ordinary object could have just delivered a fatal blow to his entire existence. The voice of the Attorney General still echoed in the space between his ears, calm, cold, utterly authoritative. State Attorney General Marcus Jones, I understand you're in my sister's apartment? He lifted his gaze from the phone to Maya. Gone was the contemptuous smirk, the predatory assessment. His eyes now held a mixture of raw fear, disbelief, and a dawning horrified respect that was entirely involuntary. He saw her now not as the insignificant target he'd perceived, but as something entirely different, the sister of Marcus Jones, a direct conduit to the highest levels of state power, someone he had just catastrophically threatened and intimidated, while likely being recorded by the Attorney General himself. The sheer, monumental stupidity of his actions crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. Every racist assumption, every shortcut taken, every abuse of power he'd ever gotten away with seemed to coalesce into this single career-ending moment. He opened his mouth, desperate to say something, anything, an apology, a denial, an explanation, but the words wouldn't form. His throat felt tight, constricted. What could he possibly say? How could he possibly explain away the threats, the intimidation, the blatant abuse of his position, now that the Attorney General himself was implicitly involved? He felt sweat prickle on his forehead, cold and clammy despite the warmth of the apartment. His carefully constructed world, built on a foundation of swagger, intimidation, and the protective shield of the blue wall, was disintegrating around him in real time. He began backing away instinctively, stumbling clumsily over his own feet. As he retreated towards the door he had so confidently blocked just moments before, his movements were jerky, uncoordinated, like a puppet whose strings had been abruptly cut. His eyes darted wildly around the small apartment, taking in the bookshelves, the worn furniture, the half-eaten noodles. Details he'd dismissed earlier now seemed imbued with a menacing significance. This wasn't just a random apartment. It was the Attorney General's sister's apartment. He felt trapped, exposed, stripped bare under an invisible, high-powered spotlight. He fumbled behind him for the doorknob, his primary instinct now simply to escape, to put distance between himself and this catastrophic situation, as if physical removal could somehow undo the damage already done. But escape was no longer an option. Just as his trembling fingers closed around the cool metal of the doorknob, the muffled but unmistakable sound of heavy, purposeful footsteps pounded in the hallway outside Maya's apartment. They were approaching rapidly, accompanied by the sharp crackle of police radios. Dixon froze, his hand still on the knob, his blood running cold. Already? How was that possible? The Attorney General must have acted instantly, decisively, unleashing the official apparatus with terrifying speed. The apartment door, still slightly ajar from Dixon's earlier entrance, was pushed open fully. From the outside, framed in the doorway, stood two uniformed patrol officers, young but with expressions set in grim professional neutrality. They moved with practiced efficiency, flanking the entrance, their presence immediately official and non-negotiable. Behind them, stepping purposefully into the doorway, was a man Dixon vaguely recognized from departmental briefings, Captain Miller from Internal Affairs, a known straight arrow with zero tolerance for misconduct. Miller's eyes, sharp and assessing, immediately found Dixon, taking in his disheveled state, his pale face, the palpable aura of panic radiating from him. Miller's gaze then flickered briefly towards Maya, standing calmly near her armchair, before returning to Dixon with undisguised disapproval. "Detective Dixon," Captain Miller said, his voice flat, devoid of any inflection, which somehow made it more chilling. There was no preliminary questioning, no request for an explanation. The decision had clearly already been made at a level far above Miller's pay grade. "You need to come with us, now." Dixon felt the last vestiges of his composure crumble. He wanted to protest, to argue, to deny, but the words wouldn't come. He looked from Miller's implacable face to the impassive uniformed officers, then back to Maya, who simply watched him, her expression unreadable, but holding no trace of the fear he had tried so hard to instill. There was nothing left to say. He had played his hand, betting everything on his own prejudiced assumptions, and he had lost spectacularly. He nodded mutely, a single jerky movement. He felt utterly hollowed out, stripped of his badge, his authority, his identity in a matter of minutes. As he stepped forward, towards the waiting officers, he heard the distinct metallic click as one of them produced a pair of handcuffs. They weren't immediately applied, but their presence was a clear, humiliating symbol of his fall from grace. He was no longer Detective Dixon, the enforcer. He was now simply Dixon, the suspect, being escorted from the scene by his own colleagues. Under the direct or indirect orders of the State Attorney General, whose sister he had just threatened. As Captain Miller and the officers escorted him down the hallway, leaving Maya standing alone in the sudden, echoing quiet of her apartment, Dixon knew, with absolute, sickening certainty, that his career was over. The real question now was whether his freedom would be next. The storm he had unleashed upon Maya Jones was now circling back to consume him entirely. The moment Attorney General Marcus Jones disconnected the call with his sister Maya, the levers of state power began to move with astonishing speed and precision. The initial shock and cold fury he felt upon hearing her trembling voice detail, the threats made by Detective Dixon, transformed instantly into focused, decisive action. This wasn't just an abstract case of police misconduct anymore. This was personal. This was his family. This was a direct assault on the principles he had sworn to uphold, occurring in the supposed sanctuary of his own sister's home. His first call was to the state police superintendent, bypassing several layers of local command. His voice, usually measured and diplomatic, was tight with controlled rage. He conveyed the essential details: a credible allegation of witness intimidation, physical threats, and potential prior misconduct involving evidence tampering by a specific City Detective Frank Dixon, currently located at his sister Maya Jones's apartment. He requested immediate, discreet backup to secure the scene and detain Dixon pending investigation by the AG's own office, emphasizing the sensitivity and the potential for escalation. He also ordered the immediate preservation of all dispatch logs, body cam footage, from Dixon, his partner Miller, and any responding units, and precinct records related to the Garrett Lane arrest incident Maya had witnessed. Simultaneously, Jones alerted the chief of his own criminal division and the head of his newly formed police accountability unit. Within minutes, experienced investigators from the Attorney General's office were dispatched towards Maya's apartment building, instructed to coordinate with the responding state police units and take primary control of the situation, effectively sidelining the local precinct's internal affairs initially to prevent any potential interference or premature blue wall circling of wagons. Captain Miller from the City PD's internal affairs, known for his integrity, was notified and directed to the scene primarily to handle the official procedural aspects of relieving Dixon of duty on site, under the watchful eye of the AG's investigators. Back at Maya's apartment building, the efficiency was palpable. The uniformed officers who first appeared were state police troopers, not City PD, minimizing the chance of immediate personal loyalties interfering. Captain Miller arrived moments later, briefed en route about the gravity of the situation and the direct involvement of the Attorney General's office. Dixon, still reeling from the shock, offered no resistance as he was formally relieved of his badge and weapon, read his rights pertaining to potential criminal charges, not just departmental, violations, and escorted uncuffed but under close guard to an unmarked state vehicle waiting downstairs. The message was clear. This was not being treated as a standard internal disciplinary matter. As soon as Dixon was removed, investigators from the AG's office, professional and calm, entered Maya's apartment. They introduced themselves clearly, expressing concern for her well-being and assuring her of her safety. They didn't pressure her for an immediate formal statement, recognizing the trauma she had just endured. Instead, they focused on securing the scene, documenting the context and offering support. They inquired if she felt comfortable remaining in her apartment or if she preferred temporary relocation, an offer Maya, regaining her composure, politely declined for the moment, wanting the stability of her own space. They ensured she had direct contact numbers for the lead investigator and victim support services. Their presence was reassuring, a stark contrast to Dixon's menacing intrusion. The investigation launched by the Attorney General's office was immediate, broad and deep. Dixon was formally suspended without pay, confined to his home, and ordered to have no contact with Maya, Officer Miller, or anyone related to either case. His personnel file, often a closely guarded document within precincts, was subpoenaed by the AG's office. Investigators began meticulously reviewing not just the Garrett Lane arrest report, but Dixon's entire history, use of force incidents, citizen complaints, especially those previously dismissed or marked unfounded, arrest patterns, and known associations within the department. Simultaneously, a separate team focused on the young man Dixon had arrested in the alley. Locating him in county lockup, they found him bruised, frightened, and facing felony drug charges based entirely on the narcotics Dixon had planted. Presented with the information that the arresting officer was under investigation and that a witness, Maya, had observed the incident, the young man, initially terrified of further police retaliation, haltingly recounted his version of events. Being stopped without cause, roughed up, and the sudden appearance of the drugs he swore weren't his. The charges against him were immediately put under review by the AG's office, with a high likelihood of being dropped entirely. The rookie, Officer Miller, became a key focus, brought in for questioning not by his own department's IA, but by seasoned investigators from the AG's office. Miller crumbled quickly under the intense pressure and the knowledge that the Attorney General himself was involved. Faced with the potential of being charged as an accessory or facing obstruction charges, and perhaps wrestling with his own conscience, Miller confirmed Maya's account. He admitted Dixon had used excessive force, admitted seeing Dixon plant the drugs, and confessed that Dixon had coached him on how to write the report to cover their actions. His testimony became a critical piece of evidence against Dixon. The AG's investigation wasn't just about Dixon anymore. It was peeling back layers, looking at potential patterns of misconduct, supervisory oversights, and the systemic issues that might have allowed an officer like Dixon to operate with impunity for so long. The single terrifying encounter in Maya Jones's apartment, triggered by Dixon's fatal underestimation of his victim, had inadvertently blown the lid off something much larger, sending shockwaves through the city's police department and signaling that under Attorney General Marcus Jones, the old ways of burying misconduct were no longer guaranteed. The system, jolted into action by a threat against the AG's own family, was finally responding with the force it should have applied all along. In the days following Detective Dixon's removal from her apartment, Maya Jones found herself navigating a strange new reality. The immediate, visceral fear had subsided, replaced by a low hum of anxiety and the disorienting feeling of having her quiet, predictable life thrust into an unwelcome spotlight. Even if that spotlight was currently confined to official channels, investigators from the Attorney General's office were respectful and professional, but their presence, the formal interviews, the recounting of traumatic events, both the alleyway beating and Dixon's threats, took an emotional toll. Each retelling felt like reopening a wound, forcing her to relive the fear and the violation. Yet with each retelling, her voice grew steadier, her resolve hardening. She understood the necessity of her testimony, the crucial role her eyewitness account played, not only in Dixon's downfall, but potentially in freeing the young man he had framed. The Attorney General's office provided her with discreet security, an unmarked car parked down the street, regular check-ins from plainclothes officers assigned by the state, not the city PD. While she appreciated the gesture and understood its necessity given the explicit threats Dixon had made, the constant presence of protectors felt like another layer of abnormality, another reminder that her life was no longer entirely her own. She longed for the simple anonymity she had cherished before, the ability to walk home from the library or browse a bookstore without a second thought, without the faint shadow of potential danger lingering at the edges of her awareness. Her brother, Marcus, was a constant source of support, though their conversations were now tinged with a gravity that hadn't existed before. He called her daily, his voice tight with a mixture of protective fury towards Dixon and deep concern for her well-being. He assured her repeatedly that she was safe, that his office would handle everything, that Dixon would face the full consequences of his actions. He expressed immense pride in her courage, both for witnessing the initial crime and for standing up to Dixon's intimidation. Yet Maya could also hear the unspoken guilt in his voice, guilt that his position, his public profile had perhaps inadvertently made her a target, or at the very least put her in a situation where such a confrontation was possible. She tried to reassure him, insisting she would have spoken up regardless, but the complex emotions hung between them. Their sibling bond, always strong, deepened, forged anew in the crucible of this shared crisis. Despite the upheaval, Maya insisted on returning to work at the library as quickly as possible. Her colleagues, briefed discreetly by library administration about a sensitive personal matter involving law enforcement without revealing specifics, treated her with kindness and quiet support, respecting her privacy while offering cups of tea and taking over less desirable tasks without being asked. The library, with its familiar routines, the scent of aging paper, the quiet murmur of patrons browsing the stacks, became her refuge more than ever. Organizing shelves, recommending books, assisting researchers, these simple acts felt grounding, a way to reclaim normalcy amidst the swirling chaos of the investigation. She found solace in the quiet order of the Dewey Decimal System, a stark contrast to the disorder and injustice she had witnessed and experienced. News of Dixon's abrupt suspension and the subsequent investigation by the Attorney General's office inevitably leaked, first as hushed rumors within the city bureaucracy and police department, then filtering out to local news outlets. While the specific details of Maya's involvement were initially kept confidential to protect her safety and the integrity of the investigation, the narrative quickly formed: a decorated detective under investigation for serious misconduct following a complaint, with the AG's office taking the unusual step of leading the probe. Speculation ran rampant. What had Dixon done? Who was the complainant? Why the state-level intervention? Though her name wasn't public, Maya felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere. She noticed occasional curious glances from strangers on the bus, wondered if people recognized her from some leaked description. She avoided reading the news reports, focusing instead on her work and her books. She hadn't sought attention. Her only goal had been truth and accountability. Yet she couldn't deny the ripple effect her actions, her single phone call, had created. The impact extended beyond Dixon himself. The swift and decisive action taken by the Attorney General sent a clear message throughout the state's law enforcement. Community misconduct, especially involving intimidation and potential civil rights violations, would not be tolerated, regardless of rank or reputation. The case became a focal point for discussions about police reform, witness protection, and the effectiveness of internal affairs investigations versus external oversight. Community activists, previously frustrated by perceived inaction on police misconduct, pointed to the Dixon case as proof that decisive action was possible when the political will existed. Maya never saw herself as powerful or particularly brave. She was a librarian who believed in facts, in stories, in the quiet power of knowledge. But thrust into an extraordinary situation, she had found an unexpected strength within herself. She had refused to let fear dictate her actions. She had leveraged the one connection she had, her relationship with her brother, not for personal gain but to ensure the truth wasn't buried. Her quiet strength, amplified by the authority her brother wielded, had inadvertently become a catalyst. for significant change. She learned that day in her small apartment that power wasn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it resided in quiet integrity, in the courage to speak truth even when trembling, and in the unexpected, unshakable bonds of family that could reach into the highest corridors of justice. The librarian who loved stories had become part of a crucial one herself, a story about accountability, courage, and the loud impact one quiet voice can make when it refuses to be silenced. What happened in that small apartment wasn't just about one corrupt detective or one brave witness. It was a chilling snapshot of how power can be abused by those sworn to uphold the law, how truth can be threatened by intimidation, and how deeply ingrained prejudice can blind someone to the devastating consequences of their own actions. Detective Dixon saw Maya Jones not as a citizen, not as a credible witness, but as an obstacle easily removed, defined by her race and her perceived lack of power. He forgot that every individual has connections, that quietness is not weakness, and that underestimating someone based on bias is a dangerous, self-destructive game. For those of us who've seen corruption try to silence truth, who've witnessed the arrogance of authority try to crush the spirit of ordinary people, this story hits deep. We know that standing up when you're terrified, especially when facing direct threats from someone with a badge, demands extraordinary courage. Maybe you've been in a situation where you felt voiceless against a powerful force. Maybe you've seen injustice unfold and felt the chilling weight of helplessness. Maybe you've wondered if speaking up would even make a difference. But this story shows that real power doesn't always reside in the uniform, the title, or the ability to intimidate. Sometimes power is the quiet resolve to expose a lie. Sometimes it's the unexpected strength found in family ties that reach higher than any precinct wall. Sometimes it's the courage to make one crucial phone call, connecting truth to the authority that can enforce it. Power comes from refusing to be erased, from standing firm in your integrity even when your voice shakes, from reminding those who abuse their position that accountability can arrive from the most unexpected corners. It comes from refusing to shrink when the world tries to make you small. So if this story moved you, if it made you feel seen or heard, or simply reminded you that courage can ignite change even against overwhelming odds, please don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to remember that their voice has power, and that sometimes the most formidable strength lies hidden until challenged. Until next time, stand tall and never underestimate the connections that bind us or the power of speaking truth.